This is R.J. Rushdoony, Easy Chair number 377, January the 2nd, 1997. This evening, Douglas Murray, Andrew Sandlin, Mark Rushdoony, and I have the pleasure of meeting here with Colonel Donor. Now, those of you who've been with us a few years have heard Colonel Donor on other occasions. This evening will be a little different. First of all, a little bit about Chalcedon. As you've noticed in reading Chalcedon, we have worked to help other organizations and other groups that are not a part of the Chalcedon organization, but are a part of us in that we share a common cause and work together. We do not believe that it is our province to try to centralize these groups or to control them or to influence them in their own way. They can do a better job than we could, and that's why they're doing it. Well, Colonel Donor has a remarkable background in politics for many years, for a time having an office in the White House, and in recent years very, very active with his own organization, a very notable and important missionary group, working in a number of places. Let me add that Chalcedon is grateful to Colonel Donor because he is our financial consultant and manager and so on, and is doing much to help us. Colonel, it's a pleasure to have you here this evening. Would you tell us about your organization, the name, the address, and the phone number too, so that anyone interested can contact you, and we hope they will help your group, which is doing remarkable things in several continents. Colonel?
Well, thank you very much, Rush, for the opportunity, and just want to tell all of our listeners that Rush, you have just yourself have been so generous with your own support and the magazine over the past few years that much of what we have done, you've opened some doors, and even as we talk today about many of the different groups we're helping and working with in various countries, we have discovered these groups through your own good offices, or read about people in the pages of the report, and then we've begun working with them. I also want to mention just how unusual it is, as I'm sure all of our listeners will agree, to find an organization like Chalcedon and a man like Dr. Rushdoony who spends such a large amount of his own resources helping other groups and asking nothing back in return. Very unusual. I mean, if you think of all the other ministries that even you may be supporting, how many of them are busy promoting other groups? I'll guarantee you, maybe 1% of them, if that. So it's a very rare thing that Dr. Rushdoony does here, and we are grateful for him. One of the things I'd like to talk about, and actually, Rush, since I've seen you last time, we've had a new development. As you know, we had a number of groups that we were kind of working with, and they all came together and formed something called the Samaritan Group, which is based on the title of a book I wrote about 10 years ago called The Samaritan Strategy, a New Agenda for Christian Activism, which talked about our need to basically follow Christ in helping others, and to use the servant strategy to disciple the nations. You disciple a nation first by serving. So hence the name Samaritan Group, and it's composed now of about a dozen organizations around the world, and others are joining. We expect Peter Hammond from South Africa and his group to join. One of our key organizations, actually three of our key organizations, are from Germany. under the leadership of Dr. Thomas Schermacher,
Yes.
who I met through you, and who's obviously on the is one of the monthly contributors to the report. So we now have a dozen international organizations that are, and I won't go into explaining how all that works. It's be rather unnecessary. Just I think it's enough to say that these groups are now working together under an umbrella called the Samaritan Group, and what we are up to. I know everybody's wondering, what's the point here? What are they doing? What we are up to, Rush, is to reconstruct nations who happen to be receptive. And I've said that this way on purpose because I know the key of what I've just said is nations that are receptive. Here, I think all of our listeners are aware that America at this point in history is not very receptive to the idea of being reconstructed. Certainly the secularists aren't, and the churches aren't either. But in many nations, the culture is much more open to addressing the problems that they face through biblical law. And what we have done is try to find some of those nations that we felt were open to the gospel and to go in and begin working with leaders within the country to reform the church and to reconstruct the culture and the government just as you have laid out in your 70-some books, Rush. Now that's a little capsule. I know I want to talk about some of the different countries we're working in and what we're doing, but I don't want to just continue to monopolize. Should I give the address up front and then I'll give it
twice,
again at
surely.
the end? So for those of you that think you might want to know more about, let me give you our address now, and we'll repeat it again at the end of the tape. It's the Samaritan Group, and the address is 12215. So that's 12215 University Boulevard, Suite 130, and it's Orlando, Florida, home of Mickey Mouse. That's easy to remember. 32817. I'm not implying that our work is Mickey Mouse, however. So before I go into talking about several of the different nations, does anybody want to ask a question or make a comment? Or
Yeah, Colonel, would you be willing to just go into a little more detail? You talked about the Samaritan strategy. I've read the book and it's outstanding. One of the points that you make in the book, in fact the main point, is that ultimately politics is not the answer in reconstructing a culture. We need to be involved, but it's not basically the answer. The point you're making is if we're going to follow the Lord, we need to be involved in godly private charity. Now, would you talk about how that relates to the Samaritan Group, that idea first of all, and then how it relates to the Samaritan Group and what you're doing?
Well, as you know, Andrew, my years in politics was based on, the theory that you're talking about, that politics is the answer. And even as a leader of the Christian right, that was pretty much my working theory. The Samaritan strategy was a breakthrough for me and many others in realizing that if we wanted a community to follow our agenda, the way to do it was not to go in as a political front and just start propagandizing our point of view. The way to go into a community was to begin serving it, because as you begin serving your way up, for instance, you volunteer on all sorts of local committees, or you open up various, there's 100 different needs in every community, either with the youth, with the elderly, with the sick, with orphans, with widows, with crime, with illiterate people, hungry people, so forth, and so on. Many things that we can do as Christians to help serve in the community, both in private groups or in some sort of a quasi-governmental committee where they have citizens volunteer their time. So the concept in this country now was, which is when that book was addressed to really the United States, was to urge our people to begin serving the community in various methods and gain a reputation within the town, like the elders of the gate, as we know from the biblical model. Why were those elders there? They didn't get there because they got voted there, because they gave the best speech or had a report card that they handed out. The elders got there because they demonstrated wisdom and stewardship and service. And of course, obviously, they demonstrated a tremendous knowledge of God's law. But the principle here is that if you will serve your community, you will be given, as you do that, you of course are given responsibility for whatever task you volunteered for. If you volunteered to run a soup kitchen, you obviously have the responsibility for that. And responsibility, and here's the key, listen carefully, if we want to lead our communities, responsibility always leads to authority. If you have the responsibility, you are given the authority, and then if you do that well, it leads to greater authority. Here's a simple example. You join some sort of a fraternal or religious, just an association, a club. You volunteer to be the secretary, so you take notes at meetings or send out notices, whatever. It's not a very important job. But you'll notice that when you volunteer to be secretary, the first thing that happens is you have certain responsibilities. And as you carry them out responsibly, you are given the authority to do so. So now you are a person of authority. You have all the authority that job is legally entitled to. If you fill it, and even you say, well, that might be inconsequential because secretary is not very important. But watch this. A person who serves faithfully as secretary then can the next year be nominated as treasurer or vice president, and then with that, fulfilling that responsibility well and faithfully and that authority, they eventually are qualified and have earned the right to do what? To be elected the head of the local Kiwanis Club, the president. Well, that simple little example applies to the entire city, into the county. The problem with our people and myself is we wanted to go in and run for Congress the first day that we got active. And what the Samaritan strategy said is no, spend 5 or 10 years serving the city in a much less glamorous way, and then let your record of service elevate you up. And that theory is what, I shouldn't say a theory, it's a methodology. That methodology we're now transferring to the third world.
Well, it's a biblical idea. The Bible says if you're faithful in that which is least, you'll be faithful in that which is much. And what you're really suggesting, it seems to me, is it's a bottom-to-top approach rather than a top-down, a heavy bureaucratic top-down approach.
Exactly.
You've done a great deal in Central America, Africa, and elsewhere, and taking people out of refugee camps and teaching them to be useful people. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that and similar programs that you are conducting?
All right, Rush. And incidentally, since you mentioned refugee camps, I was not even going to talk about this. I didn't even think about it, but because this is something that we're kind of doing on the side. But for those of your listeners that are concerned with the tremendous upheaval that we've seen in Central Africa with millions of refugees coming out of Zaire and into the Burundi area, and your magazine has printed very incisive articles by Peter Hammond on this, and our group was mentioned in one of those articles. But if some of your listeners would like to help with the process of not only resettling those refugees, but more importantly, taking care of the orphans, our organization is doing several things. And let me explain the problem. First of all, number one, you've had millions of people slaughtered in those countries over the last several years, creating hundreds of thousands of orphans. But just this last month, as we've been reading, or last, I should say, maybe 2 or 3 months, reading the headlines, and we've read about this 1.5 million refugees that trekked out of Zaire into Rwanda. Now, I want our people listening to realize they didn't get in their automobile and leave home. They walked over 100 miles, most of the way without shoes, in jungle, and most of the way while being shot at, so they were on the run. In this process, over 84,000 little children were lost, separated from their families. We now have 84,000 new orphans. And what would happen is a family, first of all, you got 1 million people that are kind of moving at a trot, so it's a little chaotic to say the least, and they're not moving on an 8-lane paved freeway. They're moving on jungle trails and through jungle. And then when they would be attacked by 3 different armies along the way, of course, and particularly at night, all pandemonium would break loose, and families often with 8 or 10 children would just run. In this process, 84,000 children were separated from their parents. Many of these children were even shot and wounded in various other ways. We are now trying to take care of these children. We have opened up 2 orphanages. We have about 100 children at each. And we have now contacted several groups in Burundi and Rwanda who have asked for our help in opening up to several thousand more children. So, of course, all of this takes finances, so we're simply saying, whatever donations people might want to send, and let me say, when we get donations through Chalcedon, because Rush has been generous enough several times to ask people to help us, we do something that we don't do normally. But when we get your donation, and we know, because we can tell where it's from, it's not from our normal mailing list, we send 100% of whatever you send directly to the field. We don't take out our normal 20%, operating, overhead. Mm-hmm. So somebody sends in $100 or $10, the same amount will be sent to, for instance, these are orphanages. So that's the refugee crisis, but Rush, I think what your listeners would be most interested in is what we're doing in, as you mentioned, Central America, and I'll mention one country in Africa, to actually bring the message of Reconstructionism home in those countries. And Nicaragua, which has been written up several times in the pages of the Chalcedon Report, our work there by Joseph McCullough several years ago. Nicaragua is really our prototype. And what happened there is we went in right after the Sandinistas were defeated in the first democratic election. Mrs. Chamorro was elected in 1990. And the first thing we did was to say, well, first of all, we had a wonderful opportunity, and I want our listeners to appreciate what better country to reconstruct than a country that had been under a, I shouldn't even call him a right-wing dictator, that's too much of a compliment. He was Somoza, who was corrupt and monopolistic. He wasn't a capitalist at all. It's just one of those old land-owning families, very corrupt for 10 years, raped the country, took all the money from the treasury, and then after him they had 10 years of communism. So this is a country that was a mess, and matter of fact, it's the second poorest country in the entire Western Hemisphere. Only Haiti is worse off. So here we have a basket case of a country. What better place to set as an example of Christians being able to go in and rebuild that country along a Reconstructionist model? And when we went in, the first thing we did, which is totally the reverse of all missionary groups, which would have gone in, distributing, leaflets for people to read, of course, people who can't eat. First thing we did is said, let's rebuild the economic base. So with your help, Rush, and with Joseph McCullough here at Chalcedon, we built, and some of our listeners also contributed, I know they did, we built a $100,000, what we call a micro enterprise loan fund. And basically what that does is it loans small amounts, $500 to $1,000, to families to start a business. Now I know our listeners are thinking, what can you start for $500? Our sound technician Bob is over there nodding his head, saying, $500, that won't even pay the rent on an office space here for 1 month. But in Nicaragua, $500, $1,000 opens up a fruit stand, a vegetable stand, buys 10 sewing machines. So you start a seamstress business, and things of that nature. These little businesses, we've now started well over, in the last 3 or 4 years, well over 300 businesses. And each year now it's growing exponentially. So this year alone we'll probably start like 150 businesses, creating thousands of jobs. Some of these companies are quite complex and they employ 20 or 30 people. You'll get a kick out of this. We were down there for an international board meeting, and we ate at several of our different micro enterprises. A little restaurant that somebody had started, and another place we went, and it was a pizza factory. And so they had 12 people, and pizzas must have been made like this in Italy. They were all standing one after another. It was a human assembly line, but they had no machinery. Everything was just being done by hand. But the thing I got a kick out of is not just that our loan had started this pizza factory, but to show you how all this interconnects. When we had our board meeting, the pizzas were brought to us by a man on a motorcycle with one of those big pizza carrier units on the back of his motorcycle. You see, he was a separate business loan. He got the idea. He knew that we had started a pizza company, and he came to us and said, how about if you give me $500 to buy a motorcycle, and then I can deliver those pizzas? And he made a contract with the pizza company. Now, all of these loans are paid back in 6 months. We have a 99% return rate of loan repayment, so they can be then reloaned. Now, what we were doing here was much more than just appeared on the face of it. It appeared on the face that we're just doing some sort of an economic thing, but here I think was the genius of our strategy to reconstruct Nicaragua, is that these entrepreneurs were all being discipled. They had to attend a weekly meeting where they were not only taught the ABCs, the basics of their business and accounting and so forth, but they were discipled in the gospel. They were discipled in the law, and what we got from them was a commitment to take 10% of their profits and put them back into their community, into orphanages, into medical clinics, into feeding the poor. And we showed them how to do that. Out of the several hundred businesses that we started, we recruited the cream of the crop, maybe 30 men and women, who we also disciple in a leadership session every week to be leaders of their country. Some of these men and women are now on the National Executive Committee of the Conservative Party of Nicaragua, which is one of the three major parties. One of the leaders of this micro-enterprise process is now discipling 2 Supreme Court members and 2 members of Congress and a half dozen other political leaders every week in his home. So what we did is we combined the economic approach with discipleship, and then we are doing much more than that. Through the same team of people that we planted there in Nicaragua, we built a large orphanage, and then are supporting 3 or 4 more orphanages and feeding centers. So altogether we care for maybe 500 children every day in Nicaragua. And we also distribute massive amounts of food and medicine and so forth throughout the country. Now, what has happened, and here's the whole message of why this strategy works, what has happened there is because we went in and served and took the responsibility. We said we're going to do these big things, these big projects, and we actually did them. Now here comes the authority, and what does it look like in Nicaragua? The president of the country calls us up. The president, we've had donors who gave us significant gifts, $10,000. They were very surprised when the president of the country wrote them a personal thank you letter. Mm-hmm. Thank you for helping the Samaritan group do this work. It's essential to our country. The Nicaraguan Congress, which is composed almost half of communists, gave us, well, I shouldn't say that, they're Sandinistas, and now they're a little bit different. They're kind of reformed socialists now, so who knows what they are. But the Nicaraguan Congress voted unanimously to give our charity down there exemption from all their normal taxes and custom fees and so forth and so on. When cabinet members, we built this orphanage out in the middle of nowhere. The president and 3 cabinet members appeared to christen it, and actually the cabinet members, all 3 of them actually stayed overnight there. This is now imagine this happening in America. You know, we can't even get a congressman to send us a personal letter. You know, you get form letters, let alone this sort of activity. But the vice president of the country is a former university professor, Virgil Godoy. Dr. Godoy would call up our manager in Nicaragua and say, gee, Mario, I just ran into several families that I think would be good prospects for your loan fund. Can you interview them? So we have captured the imagination of the whole country, and what this has done in concrete terms is open the door for our message, and our people know what the message is, and they are very clear, and they say, we are not here, we are not evangelicals, this is not revivalism, we are not, you know, not here to just quote unquote get everybody born again. You know, we are here to disciple this whole country for Christ. We are here to move the nation to a biblical law base, and the reason that you have for listening to us is to see the job that we have done so far. So I'm not saying that everybody in Nicaragua says, oh great, we can't wait to become a Christian country. I'm not saying that everybody down there is reading the institutes, but what I am saying is that there's tremendous openness now, because we have earned, by serving, we have, our people, not me, because I'm not down there in Nicaragua. My job is to kind of raise the money and kind of you know, watch over things. But our people down there have earned the right to lead, and as a matter of fact, our lead man down there was asked to be the vice presidential candidate this election for the Conservative Party, which he turned down because he felt that the work he was doing with us was more important than being elected vice president, which, you know, I was you know, pretty astounded by. But so that's our work in Nicaragua. Now, I want to hit Mexico and Uganda, but do we have any questions on Nicaragua?
How does your approach differ from the U.S. Agency for International Development?
That's a great question. Well, of course, their approach would be obviously be entirely secular, and not just non-religious, but, you know, anti-religious. Now, economically, it would be very similar. You know, micro enterprises are often used by the government, American government, or other charities like that. So, what we have done is simply used a tool that the secular world finds very effective and efficient, meaning this small loan fund idea, and use that as a basis for you know, discipling the people that we're dealing with. Now, for instance, AID offered, Agency for International Development from the United States government, was quite willing to fund, you know, to give us millions of dollars once they saw what we were doing. But Rush, I haven't told you this, but to accept their money, of course, we would have to follow their restrictions, which meant we couldn't preach, we couldn't teach, we couldn't make all of our loan applicants you know, attend our Bible training sessions. And incidentally, our library down there is equipped with all of Russia's literature. The institutes are popular within our leadership circle. We have Juan Calvino all over the place. John Calvin is available in Spanish, and our people are trained by Juan Calvino. But of course, if we had accepted that AID money, we would have had to quit all of our educational programs. And I was proud of our people in Nicaragua. They said, we don't want the money. We don't want the money if it means that we have to give up the message, because this is why we're doing it. So the answer, I guess, to your question would be, for us, the economic thing is very secondary. The gospel message is primary. For all the other groups, the reverse is true.
What are your activities in Mexico?
Mark, I was waiting for you to ask me that. Okay, Mexico. What I want to talk about there is a work that Dr. Rushdoony and I spoke at the church down there. I don't remember, 6 years ago, probably, something like that.
Yes.
And this is an amazing work in Mexico. And Rush, I was just there. We had our international board meeting in November there. I almost never got out of there because of the ice storms. You know, last time I traveled, it was ice storms. Now I'm sitting here with you all, and we're surrounded by floodwaters in Northern California. But what we have in Mexico is a man by the name of Josue Lopez, who 30 years ago reclaimed a garbage dump. It was just a large garbage dump, or had been used as a garbage dump. It was kind of a dirt hill in the middle of Juarez, which is a city of 1 million people, right over the border immediately adjacent to El Paso, Texas. And he started because there's so many street children there, he started an orphanage. And today, and Josue is one of our international directors and a member of our Samaritan group. Due to assistance from Dr. Rushdoony and ourselves and a few others, he has an orphanage which is probably 10,000 square feet with over 100 children. He has a first-rate school, which has even been licensed by the government, which is very difficult in Mexico. Of course, he has a church. But the big thing, and Rush, I believe you were down there to help us dedicate the medical clinic. This was a medical clinic that our group donated $50,000 to, and a number of church volunteers from Dennis Peacock's churches and others volunteered their labor to build. And since you were there, Rush, at that medical clinic, through our German groups and with the help of Dr. Schermacher, we just completed a medical laboratory. And now we have a first-rate surgery unit. So this is actually a small hospital.
Yes.
Now, again, to our listeners, this may seem relatively meaningless, because here in America we have a very nice medical clinic on every corner, and 3 or 4 good hospitals in every medium-sized town. But in Juarez, there's maybe 1 or 2 hospitals, period. The medical clinics they have there are garbage. None of them are nearly as nice as the one that we have. And there's a little difference with our medical clinic, and that is that we don't charge anything. So we are giving our medical services away to the orphans and to the poor. Now, if people from the community want to come, and we know that they actually have some money because they have jobs, then they pay a very modest fee. For instance, I think for having a baby, delivering a baby, the charge for them would be maybe $50. Normal throughout Juarez would be $300 to $1,000 in a regular hospital. And of course, I think for my child 5 years ago, I think it was $3,000. So you can see $50 for a state-of-the-art clinic is quite good. Just this month, they informed me at the clinic that they had somebody donate to them a $100,000 x-ray machine. So the clinic continues. It has a dental unit. The clinic continues to expand there. We did one of our loans there. Rush, you'll be fascinated by this. I had never seen this before, but several years ago we loaned a young man who was one of the orphans. He had graduated from the orphanage and wanted to go into business. He seemed to have a good business head. We loaned him $2,000. This was 5 years ago. Now he paid us back a couple of years later. We went down to see what he did with that $2,000. This young man, who is now early 30s, owns 1/2 of the entire marketplace for the city of Juarez. This huge marketplace visited by all the tourists. He has one stall after another. Now, so we might say, well, so what? Well, the point is, what is he doing with the money? He's donating it back to the orphanage, to the medical clinic, and not only that, but he has gotten a dozen of other former young men and women who have gone through the orphanage. Remember, the orphanage has been there for 30 years, so these kids have grown up now. He's gotten a dozen of the adult graduates. They have formed a group called Youth with a Vision. Now, it's not Youth with a Mission, which is a group that some people may have heard of it. It's a Youth with a Vision, and their idea is to be kind of a what do I want to say, a group of graduates that helps raise money and do things for the orphans. And every day one of these graduates is there teaching a class. The day I was there, they were teaching music. They've all requested copies of Your Institutes and Juan Calvino, which we're in the process of getting them. And incidentally, this is one of the things that if any of you listening would care to donate some funds or some computers to, when I was there, they wanted to get 30 computers so that donated to the school. And here's how silly some of these things are. They even had 24 computers that were donated, but they didn't have the $300 they needed to ship the donated computers across the American border. So just $300, for instance, could end up getting these kids several $1,000s worth of, or tens of thousands of dollars worth of computers. In any case, just as in Nicaragua, by serving, let's get back to our strategy here and tie all this together. By serving the people of Juarez and Mexico, our leadership there, namely Josue Lopez, that you know, Rush, he has earned a great reputation in Mexico. So today, here's what's happened. He's personally discipling 20 ministers from around the country that are hundreds of miles away from him. He is personally discipling 2 or 3 congressmen in Mexico City, which is 1,000 miles from him. And perhaps to me most exciting of all, this young man who I mentioned, his name is Jose, the entrepreneur who now owns half the marketplace in town. This young man who learned at the feet of our man, who in turn learned at your feet, Rush, this young man is now the head of the Human Rights Commission for the entire state that they're in there in Mexico. Now, what is the job? And our people need to listen carefully, because this is again how to work your way up into leading your country. What is the job of the Human Rights Commission in Mexico? It's very interesting. It is, and what is this commission? This commission is composed of all evangelical denominations and organizations in Mexico. And as I'm sure everybody listening knows, evangelicals up until recently were greatly persecuted in Mexico, and they're still not exactly, the favorite kid on the block. And they are still persecuted in more the remote areas. I would say today there's a lot of discrimination against them. So evangelicals, who are millions strong in Mexico, formed this Human Rights Commission, and it's so powerful, and its job, of course, is to monitor, well, when are the rights of evangelicals been impugned? When are we being discriminated against by the government or anybody else? This group has become very powerful, and the media and the government now listen to this group. And what I'm saying is, our man, our Reconstructionist guy, is the #1 guy, the chairman of this group for his state. And I think there are like 15 states in Mexico. You can imagine the influence, and the funny thing is, as everybody here is well aware, Reconstructionists are not always real popular in evangelical circles. And here's an official evangelical organ that has elected a Reconstructionist as its chairman. And of course, he's obviously not batting them over the head with the fact he's a Reconstructionist. He's just doing the work. He's doing the work. He's doing the teaching. He's just not using labels. But because, getting back to our example, he didn't start off as chairman of this group. As a matter of fact, if he hadn't been doing the good work he was doing with the orphanage, and then becoming a prominent businessman, he would never have gotten invited. But then they invited him on, and he served on the committee. Then he served as vice chairman, and now within 3 years he is chairman of this. So in Mexico, we're making good headway. And I'm sure there's some things I should say about Mexico, and I could, but let me just skip to Africa for a moment. A lot of our readers are reading about Peter Hammond, who we are also working with, who's doing marvelous things in many countries in Africa. And we, as I just mentioned, we work with Peter in some areas. Well, what I'd like to mention in Kenya and Uganda, we have been particularly active. And let me talk about Uganda. I think that's the most interesting thing. Uganda and Zambia. These are countries that are very open to the gospel. I think we know, and I believe that the Chalcedon Report has carried, I know it has, an article by, I think maybe Peter Hammond on Zambia in the last year or two.
Yes.
Where he talked about the president and vice president
Yes.
of Zambia are Christians who are essentially being discipled by Peter himself, which is pretty exciting. And the vice chairman of the Samaritan group, who's a good friend of yours, Rush, Monty Wilson, just spent, as you know, spent several weeks. As a matter of fact, I think he has an article due for the report.
Yes.
Monty just spent several weeks in Zambia ministering to the cabinet there on economic principles and biblical law. And the president had Monty picked up when he got to the airport. Of course, Monty didn't, this is funny, if it had been me, I probably would have had a heart attack. Monty didn't know what was going on. He just got off the airplane and the police came up to him immediately and said, "Are you Dr. Wilson?" So he hesitated and thought, "Oh no, they must know I'm connected with Colonel Donor, and I'm going to jail." And so he says yes, and they said, "Well, the president has asked us to escort you through customs, so you don't have to, go through that." And of course, they took him to the VIP reception room, and unfortunately, he was not able to meet with the president or the vice president because they were both, I believe, out of the country or in some sort of a meeting or something. But what did happen is that Monty was interviewed on state television every night. And apparently the vice president was able to watch him one night, sent him a personal note saying, "Dr. Wilson, please come back so I can spend some time with you personally." So this is a country, again, for our listeners, where the president and the vice president and various members of Congress are saying, how do you apply biblical law to our nation? For instance, Monty was there telling them how to deal with pornography. They said, "We want to outlaw pornography, but on what basis do we do it? How do we control free enterprise from getting," because you can argue that, well, free enterprise and we should be free to sell pornography, or we should be, free to sell drugs or whatever. And this is a former socialist country. They don't know how to handle free enterprise. They don't know how to handle the moral issues. And they are open to being taught. In Uganda, we have very much the same situation, except the country is much more desolated than many. Our listeners will remember that the infamous Idi Amin, a great example of Muslim goodwill and charity, since he is of the Islamic faith, murdered several million of his own people. He was chased out of office by Milton Obutu, who then proceeded to murder just as many. And so you have a lot of dead people, and literally there are bones and skeletons stacked around the country, and that's not an exaggeration. But now the greatest curse of all has happened: the heterosexual transmission of AIDS, not homosexual, but the heterosexual transmission of AIDS has almost destroyed the entire generation between the ages of 20 and 40. What this means is that there's a lot of children whose parents are dead. And there's approximately, at the end of the Civil Wars, there were like 600,000 orphans. It's projected because of AIDS, within the next year or two, there'll be 6 million orphans. This isn't a country of only 20 million people. There's nobody to take care of these children. Now, right now, their grandparents are trying to take care of them, but obviously that's pretty hard on grandparents if there are grandparents. And some of the grandparents are also dying of AIDS, not because they got it through sex, but through other, obviously, methods, or they're dying from other illnesses there. So Uganda is a basket case, and in the middle of this, we have founded something called the New Hope Campus, and it consists of a large school, an orphanage. We have over 100 children there now, a medical clinic. And doing many things to serve the community. And now you see, if we're listening, we realize that there's a pattern here. Nicaragua, Mexico, Uganda. When we begin to serve, what happened in Russia is when we dedicated the new vocational training school, which our group funded when we dedicated that about 6 months ago, the First Lady came to dedicate it with all her bodyguards and so forth. Well, you can imagine Hillary Clinton coming to dedicate one of your new buildings, Rush. It's not going to happen. Of course, we wouldn't want her there. Maybe we would want her if we could simply figure out a way to contain her and not let her out again. Be a good use of a building, I suppose, you know. But in any case, I digress. So here the First Lady comes and gives a big speech, and the First Lady is a Christian in Uganda, incidentally. So once again, we see how all this strategy is paid off, and in Uganda, our man there, who's an American by the name of Jay Dangers, his vision, he doesn't have the funding for this yet, but his vision is to open a discipleship school for training young men and women, and then sending them throughout Africa. And incidentally, you don't know Jay yet, Rush, but he knows you. Mm-hmm. He gets the magazine, and when I first introduced him to the magazine, which was several years ago, it was in November '94, because we had my article and Monty's article about what we were doing in Africa, and I gave it to Jay, and he says, "Gee, these are all the same ideas I have." And so he'd already been eclectically collecting a lot of these ideas, but he is definitely a Reconstructionist, and here he wants to start a discipleship school there in the heart of Uganda and send men out into the neighboring, not only villages but the neighboring countries as well. So I could go on, but this I think gives our listeners a little overview that while things may look rather discouraging in this country, that the whole, Christ told us to go and disciple the nations, plural, just didn't say our own nation. And as I have said before, sometimes when your own nation is not receptive, you simply need to look beyond the borders. And I realize for our listeners, of course, they're not going to go to Uganda, and they're not going to go to Mexico. They live in this country. Although I should say that if some of you people listening have some skills, particularly anything physical, plumbers, carpenters, nurses, dentists, doctors, anything that might be useful in the third world, Nicaragua or Mexico, our places down there would be delighted to host you for a week or two while you use your skills there on behalf of our local work. And obviously they refer to this as short-term mission trips, and we do that. So several families, Rush, who have learned of this are actually gotten a burden to move down there, and they're actually taking their families and in this case moving to Nicaragua to care for for some orphans. But anyway, it is working.
Okay, how do you finance? How's the Samaritan Group? How are all these things financed? I mean, money doesn't grow on trees, so.
Well, take out your wallet, Andrew. We're taking up an offering right now.
That's why I was reluctant to ask the question.
I know you were. Well, this is a great thing here that God has providentially provided for us, is about 80 to 90% of what we're doing, and this costs millions. Our folks listening here, what we're talking about here is a $5 to $10 million a year budget. And
one is that total for all of the?
Yes, for our whole Samaritan group, and for all of these countries. And for instance, total into Nicaragua, we put about $5 million since 1990. Into Mexico, we put about $500,000. 80 to 90% of that money is provided in a very unique way. And that is that people around the world have sent their money in based on just their interest in, well, actually, let me back up a minute. Our Samaritan group, as I mentioned, is an alliance of a dozen different groups. Several of these groups are structured as international relief and development charities. So they have received lots of funds to do what we would call mercy work, feed the orphans, for instance, or educational things, medical clinics. So these groups, which are members of our Samaritan group, they, since they're receiving funds to basically, help people in mercy works, they pay for that aspect of our work. So we've gotten 80% to 90% of our work paid for in that way. So we have not had to, tap into, for instance, the friends that are listening today. And I should say that Rush has been very generous, writing up what we've been doing in the magazine. We've had people respond. One man responded. The man who I asked for, we mentioned needed prayer this week. As a matter of fact, Rush, he went down to Nicaragua, was a builder. Matter of fact, he read the magazine, clipped out the article, and pinned it on his bulletin board and said, when I get some money, I'm going to help those people start businesses in Nicaragua. And he did well one year, went down to Nicaragua, and saw what we were doing and left behind a check for $15,000, which started a whole lot of businesses. So Rush has helped. Where our need is now, Andrew, as I said, we've got 80 to 90% of this covered. What we don't have funds for is really, in one way, the most important thing what we're doing and what our listeners today are going to be interested in, and that is the funds that are needed to actually do the discipleship, the discipleship in Reconstructionism, the supplying of books and tapes, the seminars. Those funds are not available nearly as much as we need them. And you can imagine why, because as I said, these groups who have money to, have gotten charitable grants. Those charitable grants would, are applied only to doing, like feeding centers and orphans. They're not applied to us going down there and doing a seminar. So we have to rely on a few friends around the country. And so if any of our listeners today, would like to, help with a donation in that respect, it would be very much needed. Let me give you a specific example. Our team just came back from Uganda. The folks in Uganda want us to come back, and I'm glad I left out with the best part. With the Uganda thing, I forgot to say, Rush, as I think you know, when our teaching team was over there, which consisted of 3 men, Dr. Monty Wilson, who writes for the Chalcedon Report, Bill Mickler, who has written in it in the past, Bill, and then Dr. Karsten Hobohm, a medical doctor who is assisting Dr. Schermacher and myself in Germany. Those 3 men went there. They ministered for 6 weeks to 5,000 different church leaders. Everything from charismatic pastors to Anglican priests. Over there, the Anglicans are very conservative. They're essentially Calvinists in Uganda, the Anglican Church. And so our men were over there, and they go to each group for a week. Well, the point is, and imagine, ministering to thousands of leaders, and these guys are just eating up the message. Well, we've been asked to go back again, and we don't have the money to do it. We've been asked to go back, give more seminars, open up a library, and open up a permanent discipleship school there. We have a similar opportunity or similar needs in Mexico and Nicaragua, where much more assistance is needed in terms of building libraries, in terms of projecting our teaching teams into these areas, publishing books, particularly books that are translated so they can read them. And so this is where we're lacking, Andrew, for funds. So again, anything that would be sent to us, unless it was earmarked particularly for the orphans, as I mentioned in Rwanda or Burundi, anything that would be sent to us would be applied to what we would call Reconstructionist training in these countries.
So the charitable side, for the most part, is doing well. It's the educational side
that's suffering.
Well, we need both of those. Both are essential.
Well, when you look at the American public, as our listeners will probably understand pretty readily, the American public is very willing to give to charitable causes. So we don't have much trouble raising money for charitable causes. Clearly, the American public and the American church is not willing to finance the forthright Reconstructionist message. And that's where we have trouble raising funds for that. But we've got 90% of the work done, and we just need a little help doing that extra 10%. But of course, that extra 10% is the key, to the whole project. I should give the
Well,
address again, maybe.
Please give the address again, and before you do, I'd like to thank you, Colonel, for taking the time to do this. And I want to tell our listeners that we are trying to help other groups and other individuals. We wish we could also help them to come here periodically and give a report. We did have Peter Hammond here recently, but it was such a hurried visit. Perhaps next time we'll get him on tape. We did help Monty Wilson with his finances for his trip, and we hope to get a report from him for the report. But there are so many others. Aaron Kayayan working in French-speaking Africa and others like him. It's a great work that you are a part of.
Yes.
And I urge you, please, do support Colonel Donor. He'll give you the address again. And before he does, I want to say God bless you for listening. God prompt you to do more for His kingdom. All right, Colonel?
All right, once again, friends, our address for the Samaritan group is 12215. So that's 12215 University Boulevard, Suite 130, 130, Orlando, Florida, 32817. That's 32817. And thank you for listening, and to all my friends out there I know personally, hello, and drop me a line, say hi sometime.
Thank you, Colonel. One last question. I was sitting here remembering the very happy day when Dorothy and I came to your wedding, and I had a small part in the ceremony. What year was that?
1985.
1985.
It's been 11 years. 11
yes.
years. October. That was a wonderful wedding.
Yes.
Some of these people were probably there. We said never had such an unusual combination been on the platform. There was Dr. Rushdoony, Tim LaHaye, Dennis Peacock, of course, and Bob Mumford
Yes.
was there, and the White House had sent their special representative. Carolyn Sunseth came out from the White House, so it was quite a to do. But I don't think Miriam would have married me if she hadn't known that she had your approval on it, Rush. That was she was looking for the wise men of God to make sure that this redheaded guy was okay.
Well, thank you all for listening, and God bless you.